Hello and welcome to Anime Animosity. Probably one of the most important things in making a good quality story is how the exposition of the world is handled and how abilities within that world are explained. Alongside that, you also need a good premise, story to fit that premise, and finally, characters that feel natural within that world and story while also being well written and interesting with a good design, etc., etc., etc. But well handled exposition elevates a story very subtly, and it's not really something most people will notice in their first time watching an anime, or at all. Look at me sounding all pretentious. And so, I'm going to try and detail what the difference between good and bad exposition is, and how not to do exposition. Now, bear in mind that I'm not an author or anything like that, so I'm not an expert, but I'll still try and give it my best shot. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. As you'll have seen in the thumbnail, we'll be touching on the café scene, or exposition table, as I like to call it. One of the biggest offenders of this is Sword Art Online. Now, while hating on SAO isn't anything new, especially when it comes to its awful writing, it serves as a good example as to why the exposition table is a bad form of exposition. So, when at an exposition table, there is one or more characters giving the exposition, and one or more, typically including the MC, receiving the exposition. So, first off, the cafe scene almost always feels contrived and forced. It's unnatural and exists for the sole purpose of listing facts about the world or current events of the story to the audience. The main reason these scenes feel unnatural is that it doesn't make sense for these characters who obviously know what's going on to sit down and bullet point what's going on to other characters that also know what's going on. And all in all, the exposition table feels really dry and bland, since it's just factory call. There's nothing interesting about it. Though, it does do the job of explaining things to the audience, albeit not in the best way. Hence why SAO uses it, with its awful story writing and lack of ability to incorporate good exposition and character dialogue. But enough hating on SAO. Next is the explanation of abilities. No matter how this is handled, it serves the purpose of giving limitations to a character, as well as letting the audience know what they can or cannot do, or explaining what's happening if an ability has already been used. An example of both good and bad explanation of techniques comes from not Sword Art Online, but from something much more recent, yet equally, if not more, popular. Kimetsu no Yaiba Mugen Resha Hen, or Demon Slayer the movie Mugen Train. So, what do I mean? Well, the Lower Moon, an initial protagonist, good god, antagonist of the film, exhibits both well done exposition that makes sense, and not so great exposition that feels a little forced and stiff, even if it is in character for them to do what they do. We'll start with the good. So, when explaining that the spiritual core needs to be destroyed to the kids on the train so that they can defeat demon slayers, the explanation makes sense, and also feels natural, as he's explaining good god, as he's explaining his ability to someone that needs to know how it works so they can do something for him. These kids directly need to be told how it works so that they can do their job, so it fits within the story, and also gives us, the viewer, insight into what's happened and how the ability works. Now for the not so good. When to the top, the front of the train, our villain, in typical villain fashion, monologues what their blood demon art does. Now, a monologue isn't inherently a bad way of doing exposition, be it internal or an external one. The problem arises with the situation. He's on top of a moving train, talking into the wind. to no one. This scene serves the purpose of telling us what his ability does, and nothing much more. Which is why I'd say that this isn't the best way of explaining. The scene could be improved slightly by removing the hand with the mouth on it, and then it could still have acted as him explaining to the kids what his ability does, and seeing him on top of the train would have acted as a change of scenery to prevent looking at the same thing for too long. But I'm not a director or a writer, so what do I know? Now, this isn't me hating on the Demon Slayer movie. It was a pretty good film. Is it the 10 out of 10 perfect masterpiece that everybody seems to claim it is? No, but it's still good. But it, as I've just pointed out, has a handful of flaws. Now, earlier on, by earlier on I mean probably a handful of minutes, I mentioned that listing off facts about the world or situation isn't good exposition. Which, in most cases, is true. However, in the case of the isekai, where someone has ended up somewhere they don't know, that works on different premises to the world that they're from, it does make sense for someone to tell them, especially if that someone summoned the recipient, the main character, or whoever it is, into the new world, because, they want them to know what's going on. And to be honest, that, might have something to do with the oversaturation of isekai. Not that I'm calling LN writers or mangaka lazy or anything, but, it could be. But don't get me wrong, mangakas are massively overworked. I don't know much about the light novel industry, but I assume it's similar over there. Right. Having said that, doing exposition without listing it to someone isn't exactly easy. I know I couldn't do it. But when done well, it ends up hugely improving the story and fleshing out the world. For example, I'm doing this from memory, correct me if I'm wrong, but ReZero doesn't use the talk-a-bunch method of telling us, the viewer, how the world works, and instead shows us how it works, with the royal selection being a decent example of how this world handles its politics in a natural and relatively interesting way. It also highlights the subtle racism that this world has towards elves, as we see through Amelia. But maybe I'm biased, since I love the fuck out of ReZero and think it's a really well written, really enjoyable, not masterpiece, but still incredible story with really great characters, with good designs. See, nod to what I said earlier. There's one other point I want to mention on. This isn't scripted anymore. This is entirely off the cuff because I couldn't be asked to write anymore. Insight into how lazy I am. But that's beside the point. Exposition can be done through a narrator, having a break, or at the start of an episode, or in a couple panels if it's in the manga, or a block of text in the light novel. A narrator can do a job of explaining the story without breaking the immersion of a character explaining something that they shouldn't need to explain, as this is external. It's a third party outside of the world. It exists purely to tell us, the viewer, what's going on, but it doesn't mess with the characters and story to do that. Now, the one downside to using a narrator is it does break the flow of the story with a break to have the narrator tell us what's going on, which is why I say typically this would be useful at the start of an episode, or at the end, or in a moment where characters are moving between places, for example. But it still does the job, and it's probably better than the café scene, as you'll have seen from the thumbnail. So, all in all, having now finished, what's the big takeaway from all of this? Well, it's that good exposition needs to feel, or should at least feel, natural. For the characters explaining it, it should be in character, and shouldn't mess with the story and force a situation where characters can tell each other things they already know just to enlighten us. It could need some, storytelling. It's not easy, but good exposition should be done well and done with effort, and not just a lazy cop-out of, here's a table, talk. You know what I mean? But anyway, I've been Animosity, you've been you, and I'll see you all next time for another video. Ta-ta for now.